Good morning. My name is Karen Carnahan. I'm from the Ginger Hill Unitarian Universalist congregation in Slippery Rock, Pennsylvania. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalists of Greater Pittsburgh's 8th Principal Conversations Workshop. I speak for the rest of the cluster board when I say we are delighted that you have chosen to spend your Saturday morning with us, listening, learning, and conversing about the UUA's proposed 8th principle. As many of you know, the first two General Assembly votes will take place right here in Pittsburgh in 2023. We might think of this workshop as perhaps a first step in recognizing the importance and necessity of deep discernment around anti-racism and the tearing down of white supremacy culture. We'll light the chalice this morning. Shane Freeman, one of the members of the cluster board, will light the chalice for us. Shane?
Thank you so much, Karen. Hello, everybody. I'm Shane, as Karen mentioned. Our chalice lighting today, it's a quote credited to Indigenous Australian artist, academic, and Aboriginal rights activist, Lila Watson. If you have I'd like to encourage you, if you have a light source, we'll give you a moment to grab it if you'd like to light your chalice with us in your home. And if you'd also like to leave a message in the chat box, something along the lines of the chalice is lit in Pittsburgh, PA, wherever you happen to be. We'll give you a moment, just a moment or two, if you have a light source, to go ahead and grab that. And the quote attributed to Lila Watson, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Joe Shaughnessy. I'm Vice President of UUPGH, and it is my honor today to introduce today's presenter. Reverend Jay Wolf is Congregational Field Staff for the Central East region, serving congregations in Western Pennsylvania and ACR, Ohio. G hails originally from Indiana, where G learned to sing, dance, and cause trouble, the social justice kind. G is currently a member of TRUST, that's TRUUST, which represents Transgender Religious Professional Unitarian Universalists Together, and also DRUM, Diverse Revolutionary Multicultural Ministries. Sunshine is committed to helping congregations become the healthiest versions of themselves as they can do their important work in the world. G has served many congregations throughout the country, first as spiritual development director at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Tucson. G served as intern minister at West Shore Unitarian Universalist Church in Cleveland, Ohio, and then completed a chaplaincy residency at Indiana University Health Hospitals. G also served as interim minister at the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Montgomery of Alabama, First Unitarian Church of Alton, Illinois, in the St. Louis metropolitan area, and May Memorial UU Society in Syracuse, New York. During your service in Alton, Sunshine was active with the resistant movement in Ferguson, Missouri. Before seminary, Sunshine worked for 5 years as a case manager with homeless adults searching for employment in Tucson, Arizona. Sunshine has a Bachelor of Art degree from Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin, and a Master of Divinity degree from Star King School for the Ministry in Berkeley, California. Sunshine enjoys silliness, board games, music of all kinds, and thunderstorms. G particularly likes to go hiking, color mandalas, seek out new life and new civilizations, and boldly go where a small handful have gone before. In other words, G's a science fiction geek with a specialty in Star Trek. Sunshine identifies as genderqueer and transgender and uses third gender pronoun, including they, their, she, her, and z, here. Make it so, Sunshine.
Thank you so much. Oh, welcome, friends. It is good to be with you this morning. Going to note that my neighbor has a motorcycle that he likes to rev very loudly, and so if you hear something, I apologize now. I was honored to be invited by the Pittsburgh, no, that's a whole another Star Trek conversation, but anyway, the UU Pittsburgh Cluster Board, and to talk to you today about the 8th principle and to begin this conversation. I think it is very exciting that they are helping our congregations here in the UU Pittsburgh cluster take on this conversation, particularly in anticipation of General Assembly in 2023. I also welcome and offer greetings to many folks who registered for this conference who are not part of the UU Pittsburgh cluster. And just a little background on the cluster, it is its own 501c3, a consortium of 12 congregations and communities and growing, and does some really amazing work in this part of the country. So I just offer my gratitude for their good work and service in service of Unitarian Universalism and Western Pennsylvania. I was going to have someone read the 8th principle and I forgot to ask. So I'm going to do that and then we'll jump into our conversation. And one of the things that comes up when we listen to this is folks will say, well, what about the language of it? It sounds awkward or uncertain. And what I want to say is that we're living into enoughness rather than perfection. And so I just invite you to, if you're a person who focuses on grammar or how things are wordsmithed, to set that aside for a moment and look at the spirit of the thing, if that makes sense. So it says this: we, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote, journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. And so why do we need an 8th principle, I think, is one of the questions that comes up for folks who are just learning about this. And I've appreciated listening to Paula Cole-Jones and Bruce Pollock Johnson, who are the co-creators of this particular principle. And one of the things that Paula Cole-Jones said is, after working for decades with Unitarian Universalist congregations as a member and as a consultant, that she started to understand that you could live all 7 principles and never once have to deal with racism or other forms of oppression. And that was concerning to her as a Unitarian Universalist committed to anti-racism work. One might choose to engage with it, but it didn't have an expectation of that. And so in 2013, Bruce Pollock Johnson kind of created a draft of a principle, and then working with other anti-racists in their part of the world, which is like DC Metro, New Jersey, Philadelphia, New York area, came up with the principle as it's presented. In General Assembly in 2017, the Gathered Assembly approved an study of this particular principle for future work. And then Paula Cole-Jones was invited to be on the Article 2 task force, which Article 2 in our bylaws of Unitarian Universalism is our principles and our sources. And so they are reviewing our principles and sources, and the first votes for that will be at General Assembly at Pittsburgh in 2023. So that gives you a little bit of context and history of what the thing is and how we got here. But I don't think that gives you a sense of the spirit of the thing. So one of the things I do want to say is that to date, 83 congregations that we're aware of, because we frequently aren't aware when congregations vote to approve this, but 83 congregations that we are aware of have voted to approve the 8th principle as part of their own congregation's life and commitment. And so they've added it to their own principles. Out of those 83, 17 of them voted to approve it just this last Sunday. So there is a big group of congregations that are have been going through a process of discernment in the past year and voted on it. We expect another large contingent of congregations to join that in the coming weeks. We know some tomorrow and some the week after that. And here in Pittsburgh, the congregation I'm aware of is Ginger Hill. And so I want to thank Ginger Hill for their leadership, and you're going to hear from one of their folks later today. Who have chosen to engage with this work. So it's a growing movement. It's definitely something that congregations have been taking on individually and personally, and there's different ways of working on it. Some have decided they don't want to vote to approve the eighth principle until they're already doing some good anti-racism work in their communities. Others are making that commitment knowing that they aren't quite there yet, but are going to work toward it, and the principle will support them in moving in that direction. So there's a lot of ways to go at this. So to bring spirit into it, for me, the way I enter into spirit is through music. And by the way, for folks wondering about that use of the word spirit, I am not a theist. It is not me. I'm a natural humanist by all rights. And so for me, when I talk about spirit, I talk about the kind of energy and connection that we all have. But spirit is whatever it means for you. So when I'm using language that may feel theological or whatever, please translate that to whatever's meaningful for you. I don't presume that we all speak one language, and I cannot possibly translate for everyone today. So I will do my best, but just be aware of that. So one of the ways I enter through it is, spirit is through music. And so I want to start with a hymn that may sound familiar to you. And it goes like this. Where you go, I will go, beloved. Where you go, I will go. Where you go, I will go, beloved. Where you go, I will go. So that's the start of the hymn. And a footnote on this hymn, the first time I heard it sung in from a community of people was Reverend Marta Valentine speaking to a group of Unitarian Universalist ministers and talking about the experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in ministry, and the challenges that many folks face in serving congregations, particularly congregations that are predominantly white, when all of the societal expectations and stereotypes and things are placed upon a person trying to lead in an authentic and meaningful way. And the hymn is a song, Where You Go, which is written by Shoshana Jedwab, who's a Jewish human. And her music, by the way, she's fine with congregations utilizing that hymn, and you can contact her to give her some money if you like, but it's certainly open to folks to use. And the hymn that I love about that, Where You Go, I Will Go, Beloved, is the notion that we travel on this earth together. We belong to one another in very significant ways. And the eighth principle for me is inherently about the kinds of relationships we want to have with folks who frequently experience being ostracized, separated, made different by the way our society organizes and coordinates things. And so when we talk about what it means to do anti-racism work, I think folks immediately go to, well, what do I do? What are my personal actions? Without taking into consideration the larger systemic ways that things interact, the ways that we've inherited things from generation to generation, the complexity of things. And so in doing this work, I think the first thing that's really important to pay attention to is the call to be in relationship with each other. That we are all very different individuals with very different needs. One of the ways I know this is true is like, we have the phrase from Francis David, we do not all need to think alike to love alike, which sounds great, right? Like we all have different ways of thinking, but we all love the same. But I'll tell you, at least for my relationship, and you can tell me about the relationships in your life, but my partner and I have very different ways we like to be loved. And if I tried to love my partner the way I like to be loved, that would not work. Anybody else familiar with this particular phenomenon? Am I the only one? Like, you know, my mother had different ways of wanting to feel love. You know, everybody in my life has their, you know, that's why they have the, what is it, the 5 love languages. You know, some folks really like presents and some folks really don't, right? Some, you know, we all have different ways of being in this. And if that's true, then how are we held present to one another? What does it mean to really go together? in beloved community, knowing that we have different needs and expectations. And this is where I love the language of Paula Cole-Jones. She talks about the importance of thinking of ourselves as communities of communities. You know, that we are a community here of multiple communities. And owning that community space really matters in order for us to be wholehearted and ethical in our relationships. And it requires that we be in relationship and talking to each other in community and connection. It also means that we need to be willing to hear each other, not for necessarily what we expect, but for the many various needs that we each all have. And then actually the diversity of needs and the ways that we communicate and all of that is part of the beauty of this planet and this world and this existence, right? That is a gift. So we're called into relationship. One of my favorite tools for thinking about all of this is to think about the platinum rule. And so how many of you have heard of the platinum rule? Just raise your hand, that's fine. I mean, lots of folks have heard of the golden rule, right? And the golden rule says that treat others as you would wish to be treated. But as just illustrated, the way my partner wishes to be treated is not necessarily the way I wish to be treated, is not necessarily the way you wish to be treated. And so if I use the golden rule, I may still not be in good connection or relationship with you. The platinum rule takes it a little bit further and says, treat others as they would wish to be treated. In other words, recognizing that it's on us a little bit to learn about all the different ways that people wish to be treated. Now, does that mean we're going to get all of them? No, that's okay. But it certainly asks us to be aware of the needs and the challenges of various people in our communities, and to be present to this. In other words, what I think it takes is an attitude of hospitality. The notion that we are here to create space for one another, to let each other be wholehearted, spiritual, mental, emotional beings, right? Many folks came to Unitarian Universalists from the 50s through to the 80s as a result of being in communities who didn't let them be wholehearted, ethical beings, right? Many folks came to us having experienced spiritual abuse in other communities, who told them that the what they thought or how they felt or who they loved was somehow wrong and therefore meant that they were sinners or not good people or not whole people. And Unitarian Universalism has always said, no, that's not true. You get to be an ethical, intellectual, thoughtful, spiritual, emotional being who is whole and loved in religious community. And all of our religious communities hold to that we each get to be who we are. The challenge is that the society we were born in naturally makes it so that we don't get to fully understand the full breadth and wisdom and needs and challenges of everyone in our community. There are ways in which our society has been structured that actually make it so that we don't have to be aware of every single kind of need or thing in our community. And not every single, but we don't have to be aware of some of the various challenges and needs. An attitude of hospitality invites us to think about who are we welcoming into our space. The thing I love about the eighth principle is it invites us into considering anti-racism and anti-oppression without the expectation that our congregations are suddenly going to become diverse somehow. Not every congregation is going to have diversity, just so simply by where you are, right? You may have folks of color who can attend, you may have trans folks who can attend, you may have folks with different kinds of disabilities, but you may not. But the question is, if someone were to show up in your congregation who comes from a marginalized location, would they feel hospitality? Would they feel connected and welcome and be able to be their whole selves in your communities? And despite all of our efforts within our congregations, that's not always been possible. And believe me, we all have tried. I believe that. I know our congregations have made efforts. And yet we hear continually from Black, Indigenous, and people of color the kinds of racism that they experience and the ways it's been difficult to be able to stay in community. And so what we're asking for is an attitude of radical hospitality and radical inclusion. And in that radical, what I mean is we go against what society has created for us. I gotta say, if there's a legacy that a lot of Unitarian Universalists hold proudly, is that we don't do what society necessarily expects of us, right? Are there any other kind of like, I'm railing against society folks in this room? I suspect that there are, right? Like, we proudly say we are not like every other place that exists. That's part of who we are. And so what the eighth principle asks us to do is keep taking those further, keep taking that identity of being radical further and saying, it's not just the experiences we're already aware of, but also the experiences many other people we're welcoming into our communities that we want to be attuned to. Where you go, I will go, beloved. Where you go, I will go. Where you go, I will go, beloved. Where you go, I will go. For your people are my people. Your people are mine. For your people are my people. Your people are mine. Part of what we are called to do in this work is to say, we belong to each other. We care for each other. I think of some of the most radical Unitarians and Universalists during World War II, many of whom were put in concentration camps or were arrested or even killed for their values of saying that your people are my people, that harming any of these folks is harming me. And a lot of those folks were killed. We talk about Flower Communion and Norbert Chopik, and it's important to note he died in a concentration camp with that value at his core, that we belong to each other and that we live our lives caring for and supporting one each other. Now, does that mean you need to go off and die in the service of, racial diversity in this country? No. But it does invite us to consider the reality that being radically inclusive means we take to heart that my needs are not the only needs that need to be centered. And that when we start to look at and pay attention to the experiences and challenges and wisdom and reflections of communities not our own, that we start to see something new and different. I love Unitarian Universalism, and I also note that we have at the beginning that uni, U-N-I, at the beginning of both phrases, and that unity piece. And I think we hold a lot on to our commonalities despite our differences. And I think we need to start to shift into our differences in spite of our commonalities. And one of the ways I think about this is I think about the way that there is a unity of the earth and there's a unity of the universe where we are all part of that. But when you look at the earth and the universe, there's so much diversity, and that each part of our society, of our universe and of our planet and of our biomes, they all have a part to play with each other. That in fact, if there was a unity of how different parts of our planet work together, then we wouldn't be able to survive. One of my favorite fun facts is that the desert in North Africa, this huge swath, the winds blow that dirt out into the Atlantic. And if they don't blow enough sand out into the Atlantic, there are a few things that happen. One is we get an increase in hurricanes for that year. And the second is that the dirt doesn't make it to the Amazon. And the Amazon creates so much energy, it can't create its own dirt. It requires the dirt from Africa in order to keep the trees in Brazil and the Amazon alive. Pretty spectacular, isn't it? I mean, I think that's just one of my coolest, favorite fun facts about the way this planet is interconnected. And so we know that literally this planet thrives on the differences of the ways the biomes and how they interact with each other. You can't have the Amazon without North Africa, right? They require each other. And that North African desert used to be a giant lake. And if it wasn't for all of the plants and critters that died and created that desert, that dust would never have been created. We cannot fathom the ways in which we are interconnected. And I really feel strongly that the eighth principle calls us to live deeply into that seventh principle, right? that we are all interconnected and that we all need each other. Our eighth principle asks us to live into a universalism, the one of diversity and inclusion, that values our differences as inherently valuable and worthy, that invites us to consider those things. And it's not easy work to do, my friends. Where you go, I will go, beloved. Where you go, I will go. Where you go, I will go, beloved. Where you go, I will go. For your people are my people. Your people are mine. Your people are my people. You're divine, my divine. You're divine, my divine. And again, I know religious language. When I think about divinity, I think about that which is sacred. And for each of us, that can vary. For some folks, that sacredness does come from God or gods or goddesses. For some folks, that comes from family. That sacredness, that divinity comes from the people in your lives that you're connected with. For some, it comes from the planet. For some, it comes from science and physics. Wherever you find that sacredness, that's what we're talking about here. And so that divine, the idea of your divine being my divine, is that we hold not just as sacred that which we value personally, but all that's all that is valued within our congregations and our communities. That we hold each other's values with a sacredness. Now, we don't have to agree, that's okay. And we certainly want to set boundaries with one another. So if there's something that really is feeling a challenge or harm to you, being able to say that and communicate. But I love one of my favorite Jewish philosophers is a man named Emmanuel Levinas. And he's the kind of person, like, I spent a chapter reading, or 6 weeks reading a chapter of his work. He's that kind of person, right? So, I'm not saying go buy an Emmanuel Levinas book today. That unless you're really a diehard and want to jump into that, I wouldn't. But the long and short of what he was saying is that, and he's saying this in the early 1900s, that we are all born with kind of an innate allergy to difference, to otherness. And we look for sameness, and for a whole lot of really important reasons. There's a safety in finding people who are like-minded and like-hearted. There's a feeling of connection. You don't have to do a lot of translation. But he also points out that we miss out a lot if we only look for sameness and if we only try to create sameness. And one of the things he says, and I've lived into this in so many ways, is there's a moment, and I want you to think about a time when you were in a conversation with someone and you've been listening for a while and you started to understand what they were saying for not how you think about things, but how the person in front of you thinks about things. Have you had that experience? Right? Where you're really listening deeply enough that you feel the way you think shift. And you're actually starting to understand something about the way that person thinks about the world. Emmanuel Levinas says that when that happens, that space between two people listening, that's where God lives. And if you're a science fiction geek, it's essentially grokking. So to grok someone, to really understand someone for their own perspective. What I think about radical inclusion is that it really invites us to start to listen for things that are not within our own experience. And that's not an easy thing to do. The eighth principle actually invites us to lean into that which we don't know that we don't know. Reverend Julica Herman de la Fuente does this presentation in which she creates a pie. And she cuts off about, a fifth of the pie and says, this is all of the stuff that you know. Right? So like, I know the history of Unitarian Universalism. I know when I look at a series of numbers, a lot about a congregation. I know lots about cat butts. I'm seeing that done. I know a lot about a whole lot of particular things. Then there's the things we know that we don't know. So for me, I know that I don't know a lot about quantum physics. I know it's there, but I don't know much about it. I don't know a lot about what it means to be a white man because I'm not one. I don't know what it means to be a Black woman because I am not one. I don't know a lot about a whole lot of things, right? we can be kind of comfortable with that stuff. Where we start to get uncomfortable, and by the way, this is the other, say, 2/3 of the pie, is with the things we don't know that we don't know. Now, we all know there are things that we don't know. But really understanding those things that we don't know, and particularly when it comes to the experiences of other people in our world, where they have knowledge and wisdom that we didn't know, we start to get really, really uncomfortable. And Julika points out that people can only spend a little bit of time in that space, right? I want you to think about a time when you realized you didn't know anything about something that someone was telling you, and the kind of sensations and feelings and things that come up with that. The eighth principle is inviting us to lean into that space, into those things that we don't know, and say that it's really important, the information in that part of our lives, that there's wisdom to be held there. And there's a capacity for hospitality and radical inclusion when we start to listen for those things that we didn't realize we didn't know. Radical inclusion requires us to recognize that our differences is part of what is the most holiest and most meaningful part of what it means to be human. We were not built for sameness. That's not how it works. We certainly find safety and security there, but that's not what we were built for. And the eighth principle in its history has really invited us to lean into that. So I want to close a little bit with talking about some of the things that have gone on in these past few years as we've been leaning into this work. One of the things to know is that in the late 1960s, there was a pretty significant conflict. And I'm not going to go into the empowerment controversy because that would take a very long time. But suffice it to say that in 1969 at General Assembly, there was such a conflict about what we do to support anti-racism work and racial awareness that more than a third of the General Assembly literally walked out of the meeting. And many of them never came back. And that's white and black, because we had made a financial commitment as a denomination and then failed to keep it. And in part because we couldn't, but also because there were a lot of other conflicts going on. And one of the things that's true is that led to, as Unitarian Universalists, us not talking about race for more than 20 years. We just kind of let it go. We couldn't talk about it. There was lots of pain, lots of struggle. For the LGBTQ members of the community here, I want to say one of the things that we're aware is in 1970, when the ask to start supporting gay and lesbian folks came through, there's a strong understanding that that was only supported because folks were afraid of a schism like happened in 1969. And so literally our liberation in Unitarian Universalism is built on the separateness that was created by the controversy around race in 1969. In the 1980s, there was an attempt to look at this, but it was kind of pushed under the rug after about a year. I'm sorry, my cat is yelling, so if you hear her, I apologize. And then in the early 1990s, there was a General Assembly in North Carolina, and they invited folks to come to the Thomas Jefferson Ball in period dress. And some of the Black members of the community said, does that mean you want us to show up in chains and raggedy clothing? Because folks hadn't thought through what period dress might mean if you were not white. And it led to a really intense conversation and a period of decades where Unitarian Universalists have been engaging in Jubilee workshops. Any of you done Jubilee? Okay. Have engaged in all kinds of programming to raise awareness around anti-racism, and have started to really listen to communities of color about their experiences with racism in our communities and the ways in which they've chosen to leave or not. I'll tell you, as an Indigenous person, I attend a conference called Finding Our Way Home. And in 2007, there were about 8 to 10 of us who were attending who were in the Indigenous caucus. That conference has grown from the 36 that attended that year to almost 180 who can attend. We still have about 8 to 10 Indigenous folks. We have not grown appreciably, and that's because the anti-Indigenous and colonialist ways that congregations interact is really hard for a lot of our folks, and they choose to go to other communities. Now, am I bad-mouthing our congregations? No. I want to give an honest appraisal of where we are. We are beloved people, we care about each other, and we got a long way to go. We have not arrived. And so our 8th principle invites us to say, radical inclusion means we allow ourselves to be imperfect, we engage in difficult conversations, we practice and build skills for being uncomfortable, and whenever possible, we give our most holy and sacred yes to each other, to be in relationship, whole and wholeheartedly. And so as we're doing this work, I just want you to be attuned to the fact that we have a long history of doing it. And in 2016, we had a massive conflict in Unitarian Universalism. How many of you are aware that that happened? For some of you, that might be a brand new piece of information. Some of you are aware that it happened. In 2016, we had a big conflict, and it led to the resignation of the president of the UUA, Peter Morales. And it led to a whole bunch of conversations. But the thing I want you to know is that a lot of the folks who were involved in that conflict received things like death threats from other Unitarian Universalists for what they were saying. That's not somebody else, that's us, which means it's our work to do, right? And so as we're thinking about the 8th principle, just know there are a myriad of experiences of how this work is difficult and sometimes painful and also amazingly meaningful and powerful that you may or may not be aware of. The question becomes, what are you willing to do to make sure that when someone chooses to show up in your community, they feel like they can be whole and healthy human beings in beloved community? Yeah? So with that, I'm going to put the hymn that I've been singing in our chat box. And I'm going to invite you to join in singing it, muted, of course. Hold on a second. My cat somehow locked herself in my office. All right. So as you are able and interested, please join in singing. Where you go, I will go, beloved. Where you go, I will go. Where you go, I will go, beloved. Where you go, I will go. For your people are my people. Your people are mine. Your people are my people. Your divine, my divine. So thank you. So we're going to enter into a brief time of question and answer, and then we're going to take a 5-minute bio break, and then we'll come back for some presentation from the Pittsburgh board and Ginger Hill, and then we'll have some breakout rooms just to give you a sense of the plan for the day. So right now what's going to happen is we'll have some time for question and answer. You can use the raise your hand feature in the Zoom. You can also just kind of physically raise your hand, though keep in mind I can't see you. You can type in the chat saying that you wish to speak. And then at some point I will offer an opportunity for those of you who may be on phones or other things where it's hard to get our attention to just unmute and speak at that time. So look for that moment when it comes. And with that, just going to invite 30 seconds of kind of silence and presence, and then we'll have some questions and conversation. The answer to that is yes, but let me let the cat out of the room. Okay. So do we have conversation or questions? Is the fifth principle project different than the fifth principle task force from 2015? And is this somehow related to the contested UUA trustee position number 8? And is this opposition to the eighth principle or separate? Oh boy, is that a complicated question there, Marianne. Way to jump into the deep end. All right, so here's what I want to say. The fifth principle project is not in any way related to the fifth principle task force. The fifth principle task force is looking at how do we make it so that General Assembly is accessible, because it is really expensive to go and really hard for folks to get there. And so it usually privileges folks who are retired and have the time and folks who have money. And so it is not necessarily representative of our congregations. So the task force is looking at how do we make this accessible. The fifth principle project, I will not pretend to speak to what their goals and mission are, other than to say that they are of the opinion that Unitarian Universalist Association, the board, and General Assembly are not adequately using the democratic process as they understand it. And beyond that, I'm not going to get into the weeds of what that looks like or means. You can look that up if you feel strongly about it. I don't see fifth principle as inherently opposed to the eighth principle. I do know that some of the folks involved in that probably are, but I don't know the details again. So I'm not going to speak something I don't know anything about. And keeping in mind, some folks are muted. Don, are you trying to talk to me? Okay. Marianne, I'd be happy to chat with you one-on-one about it, but I don't know that this is the forum. Okay. Where does all this take us in concrete way in our congregations? Certainly. I think Ginger Hill will speak to some of that, but I'll share some of what I know. I also know that there's some folks from Mount Airy Restoration in Philadelphia, and then certainly would welcome them to share what their experience has been. We have two congregations in my neck of the woods, UU Akron and UU Youngstown, who have taken these on. And the concrete ways have looked like, I like how Sir LeBert, who's the current board president at Akron and was on the Commission on Institutional Change report team and things like that. He talks about in their congregation, they look at the importance of in-work and out-work. That when you're doing anti-racism work, there's kind of the internal work that we need to do, you know, doing workshops, doing education, learning, and that there's the outwork we need to do, which is building relationships with organizations and communities in our own areas. And doing committed work in that sense. And one of the things he says is oftentimes congregations will have a strength towards one or the other, right? So either they're very justice, like out in the field, let's do the thing, but don't do as much of like the how do we change our congregation so that it's welcoming, or they do a lot of like the in-house, like congregation educational awareness, but aren't in relationship with communities. And that there's kind of a notion that if we're going to do this in a beloved community kind of way, we need to be in relationship. And one of the things that I think has been interesting in talking with various congregations, and I will actually love talking to Ginger Hill about this, is when you're in an area that's predominantly white, who are you in relationship with? And what almost every community starts to recognize is that there's Moral Monday movements, there are NAACPs, there's all kinds of organizations all across the country, and usually there's somebody nearby doing something. And so it's just important to have the relationship that goes beyond just your church, in part because the people within your congregation don't have all of the wisdom necessary to do this work. No one community does. We've learned this. We need each other. And so that's part of the The work is to be in relationship with folks who can help expand our knowledge and our awareness, or add to the knowledge and awareness that already exists in our communities, if that makes sense. So that's one of the answers. Do we have any folks from congregations that have approved this that want to share kind of what they're doing, knowing that Ginger Hill is going to present on this a little bit later? Okay, we'll come back to that. I have a comment. Thanks for doing this. My wife and I participated in Jubilee workshops as a part of the former Unitarian Church of Norfolk, and now we're at Coastal Virginia UU. Awesome. I also want to note there is now a Jubilee 3 that they've been offering online. They're going to offer one for the West Coast sometime mid-month, I think around Juneteenth. And then I know they will be offering some more in the fall. So if you're interested in Jubilee, I highly encourage that. It's an anti-racism program, and it's been very well developed over the years. We have a number of folks who've been to that in this call. Jules Mellon, love to hear what you think it means to be accountable as stated in the 8th principle. Accountability, I think that we started to learn this as we were doing right relations work and covenant building work, is that some folks, when they get into conflict with folks, don't necessarily want to change behavior or change who they are or be accountable in some way to the differing needs in community. And I think accountability here means saying that when we have disagreements, we need to be open to the notion that we can cause harm. I think that's been the real thing we haven't been attuned to in our conversations. I don't know about you all, but all the UU churches I've been a part of have been very intellectually oriented. Any exceptions to that rule here, right? And I think that's amazing. It's so important. We believe in education. I think that's one of the gifts of Unitarian Universalism. We have strong religious education. We have a lot of gifts with that. The part that we don't always do well with is emotional awareness. And sometimes folks call it emotional intelligence, but because there's a hierarchy around that word intelligence, I don't like using it. I like the word emotional awareness. And what emotional awareness invites to is recognizing that what we do and say can cause harm, whether we mean it to or not. And accountability invites us to recognize when we've experienced harm and also when we've caused it, and to be in continued relationship and to be open to things like reconciling or figuring out new ways of being that shift us out of unintended ways we've inherited that cause harm and allow us to be in a healthy, accountable relationship. So for me, accountability looks like engagement. It looks like an openness to have conversations that are hard. It's a willingness to hear and listen to perspectives that are not our own. And it's a willingness to shift our behaviors, ways of thinking, how we do things, so that we don't cause harm to the people who are in our beloved community. And it's tricky, right? But accountability is about engagement for me. And I suspect if you asked other people, they'd have other answers to that question. So you're getting Sunshine's opinion on this, not necessarily everyone's opinion on this. In the chat, thank you, Sunshine. Not so much a question, but a comment. Our congregations will need a lot of guidance in how to do the work necessary to bring about the goals of the 8th principle, even within our own denomination. I have seen a lot of opposition to the idea of anti-racism, and in particular, ideas of white privilege. I've seen people go from being opposed to being activists in anti-racism when they have done the work to understand the issue and how to respond to it and talk about it. But that is perhaps a smaller segment of the people in the pews. All I'm saying is we need the help in how to move forward. I hear that loud and clear. And certainly for those of you who've read the Widening the Circle report, that is a recommendation in there, is that congregations actively find tools to help navigate those conversations. I know regional staff here in Central East Region and elsewhere are looking at how do we create programs to help you do that. Any of you go to New Day Rising this year? So that conference was specifically developing tools for countering white supremacy culture. We had 1,300 participants, which is still mind-blowing to me. There is clearly a desire for information and tools and how do we do this, and we will keep providing that. But there's also ways you can connect with that locally, with organizations you can be in relationship with who do this work and have been doing it for a long time, which is another reason why I think the accountable relationships and accountable partners in community matter, that you're not doing it by yourself. And there's, yeah, certainly resistance to language like white privilege and white supremacy culture and things like that. I think that's because, I think there are a lot of reasons, but one thing I want to lift up is, I think so often folks hear white in those contexts and only those contexts. And part of the invitation is to recognize that there is a white culture, and that's okay. But so often that white culture language has been dominated by white supremacists and dominated by white supremacy culture. And recognizing that there's, you know, a community and a culture there that is positive, and that when we talk about white fragility, we're talking about white fragility, not whiteness. Those are two different things. When we're talking about some of these different things, that it's important to recognize, yes, there's privilege because of whiteness and the way it's been constructed in our society. That doesn't mean it's bad to be white. And I think a lot of folks conflate those two things, and it's really important to separate them out. Sunshine, what are some examples of measures of success that have affirmed the eighth principle? I know it'll be differ for each congregation, but I'm curious what about the ways people are measuring success of having affirmed the eighth principle. I think that's still in process. So many congregations have proved this in the last couple of years that that's a growing answer to that question. I will encourage folks on the call that if your congregation is taking this work on, there is an eighth principle working group that you can get invited to on Facebook. And I highly encourage participation in that. It is not a place to debate whether the eighth principle is worth working on. To join that group, you have to have already committed to working on the eighth principle in your congregations. But if you're committed to that and you want some resources or some what are people doing right now, that's a great place to get some good information. So I highly recommend joining that group. And if you need help joining it, you can message me or some other things. Thank you for recording this. There's much to unpack and listen deeply again. Yes, this is recorded and it will be made available to you, so just be aware of that. Paul Lawson, fully supportive of the eighth principle, but it must lead to action. No more lovely anti-racism sermon followed by all the white church members except me ignoring the African-American employee and the employee's child during the coffee hour immediately after the sermon. Absolutely. There's real work to be done in our congregations, and we've done a lot. I think UUs are good at talking about. There's a reason why there's a joke about Unitarian Universalists forming a committee to have a conversation about whether we should have a committee on a committee. Like we can get a little bureaucratic, particularly if we're uncomfortable. And so recognizing that actually that might be a sign that we need to shift from thinking into action. And that's not a comfortable thing. And it's not something we've always practiced as community. So it'll take some work, but I hear you, Paul. Absolutely. The Beloved Conversations program offered by the UUA through Meadville Lombard is a 3-year program to help us identify racist thoughts and actions we have observed as individuals, congregations, and in our communities. I've learned a great deal in this last year. Absolutely. Beloved Conversations is a great program for your congregations to get involved in. And it's a great way to kind of kickstart conversations. They've been doing it online through the pandemic, and I suspect they will continue to do so. So know that that is a program that's available to you. All right, I think that took about 15 minutes. I do want to offer for those of you who are on phones where you can't easily type in chat or raise your hand if you would like to unmute and ask a question or make a comment, you can do so now. And if you don't know how to unmute, it's *6 on your phone. All right. So at this point, we're going to take a 5-minute bio break, and then we'll come back and Karen will get us started off on our next section. So thank you everyone for taking the time and for listening. So much gratitude. We'll see you back in a few minutes.
All right, welcome back, everyone. At this point, I'd like to introduce to you the Reverend Rick Comparator, who is a affiliated community minister with Ginger Hill in Slippery Rock. Rick is going to speak to Ginger Hill's journey toward adoption of the 8th principle. So Rick, take it away. Rick, we're not hearing you.
Thank you. Ginger Hill Unitarian Universalist Congregation has had a rich history of support for many efforts and accomplishments in social justice, including having the seeds of our current work in racial justice by one of our charter members and a former congregational president, Amy Walters, who repeatedly cast a vision for great services around MLK Day and Juneteenth, illuminating beloved community. More recently, Jeff Simmons responded to the call by the UUA to participate in the white supremacy teach-in on October 15th, 2017. I was grateful for his stepping forward, even if I found the discussion afterwards not so easy to hear. My Latino perspective informs me in ways I know my fellow congregants have never experienced, like so many other BIPOC UUs. As social justice is difficult work, I think racial justice can be even more challenging. It raises conflicts, and I certainly found myself in the middle of my own frustrations. I focused my issues into presenting the 2018 MLK service. In my own life, my son and daughter-in-law were expecting their first child, my first grandchild. It made me consider my own mortality and where I come from, as well as others like me, but more importantly, what I will leave behind. Looking forward, when future generations might experience being known for their character is a beautiful dream. I wanted to be on the front lines of the change to see that before I die. Closing that MLK service, I gave a call to action and invited my congregation to put affirming the 8th principle on the agenda for our next congregational meeting. I couldn't be at the meeting for the vote, so I asked my friend Steve to give me a call after the vote so I would know the results quickly. He called me right after. I'll never forget the sound of his voice. It makes me know he is a real brother in my spiritual family, as I heard disappointment in him. It didn't pass. In May of 2020, just before George Floyd had been murdered, I was asked to do the Juneteenth service. I don't say that lightly, but too often words are used to minimize the uncomfortable while the afflicted pay the price. After a call with our congregation president, Terry Sendek, who was president back in 2018 at our first vote, I asked what the objections were so I could address them to open eyes and change minds. Some folks felt the 8th principle ideals were implied by the 7 principles. I think our 7 principles are welcoming, but we didn't find them to be enough, and I applaud our congregation for that. We wanted to support the LGBTQ community more fully, so we became a welcoming and affirming congregation. It was important to be more clear. Our drive with environmentalism was seen in the interdependent web principles, so we became a green sanctuary. And after that, we're now carbon neutral, thanks to special efforts by another former board member, Bob Majerick. Another objection was that it's already covered in the inherent worth and dignity principle. But our principles didn't change our culture, as history shows. I also shared Jane Elliott's brown-eyed, blue-eyed 39-second video demonstrating to many of us our culture needs us to keep working. Then I addressed the objections of the 7 principles being complete and how we shouldn't make changes to them as things come up, as though they should be static or unchanging. My focal point then was to cite our American judicial system, where the Supreme Court has taken a view that our Constitution should be seen as a living document. And as culture changes, we can recognize the need to more closely identify with the spirit of the ideas, making them clearer with new statements. As I ended the Juneteenth service of 2020, I gave a challenge that I want to see us address the 8th principle again. Whether or not it passes in my heart and soul, I've adopted it. Later that summer, to support our journey, Terry Sendek and Karen Carnahan decided to invite Reverend Sunshine Wolf to provide a Sunday service, followed by a Q&A. That was around mid-August. Then on September 20th, 2020, we voted to approve the 8th principle. And in our journey currently, during our last congregational meeting, we voted and affirmed the idea to create a racial justice team that will continue to do the work further. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. Pastor Sunshine, would you like to break us up into breakout rooms?
I would love to. So the first thing is, if you are able to access a Google Doc, then I've put that in the chat. If you can't, that's okay. You don't need to. But I do want to make that available for folks. In the breakout discussions, what we want you to do is address this question. And I do want to offer my gratitude to Rick for sharing his congregation's experience and for the leadership of Ginger Hill and doing some of this work, including the board of the Pittsburgh cluster. I think y'all are doing some amazing things, all of you. So in the chat is also the discussion question. What would it take to implement the 8th principle in your congregation? What steps would you take to raise awareness and or prepare for supporting it? And in your answer, it could be, I'm not sure we can, or these are the challenges we'd be facing. Like, we're not assuming that you're going to do this, but we want you to think about in a kind of group way, what are some of the steps you might take to move in this direction? What are some of the challenges and what are some of the strengths of your congregation that would help you? So that chat, the question is in the chat. There's also the link, and we invite each group, you'll be put into random breakout groups, to have one person who kind of says the name of each person in the circle when it's their turn to speak. One person who will take notes in the Google Doc. That'll be a person who has access to it and is willing. And a person to be timekeeper. And what we're going to invite is each person in the circle will be able to share for 2 minutes to answer the question. Every person goes around in the circle, has a chance to answer. You can choose to pass. That's absolutely fine. And then if there's some further conversation, discussion you want to have after you do that circle round, feel free to do so, or you can go around the circle a second time. We'll leave that up to your group. For folks who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color, we did not have very many folks register for this who identify as such. So if you would like a group specific to yourself, I'm going to invite you to stay in the main room. And if no one's available, I will join you. And if you're comfortable going into white-only spaces, that's great. We make Black, Indigenous, and people of color spaces open to folks because not everybody is having a good day, and it can be hard to hear folks say something that might be unintentionally racist or challenging. And so we want to create care spaces for folks who are most vulnerable in our communities. In this case, we're talking about Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So if you need that space, please stay here and I will work with you on that. If not, we will have you all in random rooms. And if you have any questions or challenges, you can always click the request, contact the host, and either Beth or I will come to your room and help you out with that. We invite folks to be gentle, to be kind, to assume good intentions, but take responsibility for your words. And to be aware of how much space you take up when you're doing the sharings. And with that, I think we're ready to jump into breakout rooms. Welcome back, everyone.
So,
It's great to read some of the notes in the document, which will be shared with the Pittsburgh cluster board for their conversations. But if anybody wants a copy of it, you now have the link and feel free to use it. So what I'd like to do now is actually invite each group to just share maybe one insight or one kind of elegant next step that you were discussing in your groups. We'll start with group 7. If there's somebody who's willing to share.
I don't think we know what our numbers were.
we were group 6, Kathy.
Marianne
Thank you.
and Sue, we were group 7.
Yeah. And yeah.
Clara, would you like to summarize, or shall I?
Could you please summarize, Marianne? Because I have to drop off the call. I'm so sorry, but thank you.
Marilyn,
Okay,
could you
and
mute, please,
so
Marilyn Devlin?
Oh, I'm sorry.
There were, so group 7, there were 3 of us, and we represented Unity in Oak Park, Illinois, and First Church in Pittsburgh, and East Suburban in Murraysville, just outside of Pittsburgh. I would say the key takeaways were knowing that if we haven't adopted, a congregation hasn't adopted the 8th principle, that there could be, there's the 3 different groups, the very hesitant, lots of questions and resistance. There's the all for it, no questions asked. And then there's the neutral group. And the idea that having discussion or anonymous Q&A opportunities, ways that people that are in the hesitant group can express their concerns and be listened to respectfully, to avoid the possibility that people will feel peer pressure or railroaded into voting yes, because otherwise they might be shamed by the other people in the congregation. That sincerely listening to concerns and having conversation with people respectfully. And that one idea for the people that are neutral would be to have a concrete plan to be able to show where you're trying to go, so that there's not just a sense of, okay, it's just something we're going to sign on to and nothing will happen after that. And another piece of takeaway was in outreaching and building relationships with beyond the church walls is to look for, if it's racial, look for Black BIPOC-led organizations and to follow their leadership in the work. Okay, I might have missed something. So Sue, do you know, did I miss anything? And Clara, I know you're.
No, I think that was a good summary. You mentioned that your congregation used a 9-session talking about race framework to do some education. But the sense I had from what you talked about it was that it was a little bit elementary and it could be done as self-study. So it's just a resource from the Museum of African American History and Culture, but conversations about race, I think, or talking about race, which sounded like a good thing to look at. Thank you.
Thank you.
You.
All right, group 6, that was Kathy, Marilyn, Reverend Joan, and Shane.
If you all are okay with it, I can go ahead and
Thank
read
you,
off what we
Shane.
talked about. Sure.
Thank you.
We talked really quickly about how Beaver County has already adopted the 8th principle just because there's only like 10 of us. And it was really a matter of, hey, y'all want to do this? And everyone said yes. And so we did it. A lot of the rest of the discussion, we kind of kept circling back to, how do we get where we're going? What is the end goal? How do we know? And this wasn't explicitly said, but I got the vibe. How do we know when we've won with the 8th principle? And then we kind of started talking about how there really isn't a solid destination to arrive at. It's organic. It's always going to need, it's going to change tomorrow. Whatever that goal, quote unquote goal is, it's going to change tomorrow, next week, next month. Something else is going to need to be woven into these conversations. And I think that's kind of the way it is with the rest of the principles. They change because people change and cultures change. And a really important thing, we also started talking about, with the smaller congregations, it's hard because there's not a lot of people to do the things. And while it is important for there to be people to do the things, at the same time, what's very important is to have within us the spirit of the eighth principle, so that even if we're not having a committee with a certain number of people doing a certain action, we're always trying to live that spirit. And it's kind of inhabiting how we speak and think and talk. And I think that's just as important.
I have to jump in. I agree with Shane, but I just need more focus. And I asked some questions of Sunshine that he said he would answer later. And I'm also, I guess, asking Sunshine and Rick how I can get in touch with him.
I'm happy to share my contact info if you meant me.
Yes,
Okay, I'll send that to you in the chat.
thank you.
Great. And I will come to your questions, Marilyn. Just want to make sure everybody has a chance to report out. Okay, thank you. Room 4, that's Jennifer, Joan, Lynn, and Stephen.
I was our note taker, so I'm happy to report back on our behalf. Our group made up of 1 Sunny Hiller, 1 North Hills, and 2 First Church. And we had a nice conversation. It was nice to meet everyone. And we primarily talked about how we would want to continue the education around racial justice, and primarily through small group conversations. We shared that we felt that this was a topic that you really need to kind of get to the heart of people, and we felt that that would happen best in a small group. We talked about a wider participation and a learning opportunity like Beloved Conversations, and about how we really needed more people interested in taking the lead in our congregations, and kind of a kick in the pants, like we just need to do it already. And we finally concluded with our principles being aspirational, and adding the 8th principle doesn't mean that we've already reached our goal. It means that we're committed to keep on growing and learning about racial justice, and continuing to grow to become a beloved community. And that was our chat.
Great, thank you for sharing. Room 3, that's Carol, Kathy, Dawn, Rebecca, and Rick.
Since I took the notes, I'm happy to kind of recap for everyone. That's okay. I thought our group was kind of interesting because we ranged from very hesitant about the 8th principle at this point, a congregation that's very hesitant, to a congregation that has already adopted it. So it was kind of interesting to see the range in actions that are being taken, and the range of thinking between there. So we were fortunate to have Rick in our group to be able to actually give implementation plans on what are the steps after the 8th principle is adopted, including education and broader networking with NAACP and Black-owned businesses, and forming racial justice teams that don't just include in-congregation membership. The rest of the congregations are more in that, still in the discussion range, and reading books and learning. We talked a little bit about, for First View, that we do have some BIPOC leadership, which is very helpful in presenting alternative perspectives and making sure that everyone's voices are heard in in everything that we're trying to do. But we also mentioned that we have welcoming work to do, not just for race, but for social status and education status, and that there's much work going on in just being radically welcoming in general. There's just much work to be done.
So very, very true. Thank you.
If I could add one thing, I would say that Reverend Sunshine mentioned hospitality and the way Kathy framed things. I have seen how hospitality can often be awkward in greeting guests, and it's very important to go ahead and make inroads to the people that you connect with every time you have an event and service. Hospitality is key.
Mhm. Absolutely. All right. Room 2, Beth, Linda, Mary, Patricia, and Peg.
Okay, I think I've took the notes from that group, so for that reason, I'll just kind of review where we're at. We also range from people, from organizations or congregations that went all the way from almost ready to adopt it, they've already voted on it, to we're just kind of starting out. So, you know, people aren't kind of starting at the same place. My church is one where a number of people have participated in Beloved Conversations, and our group is going to meet with our pastor in July, and we'll be talking about that program but incorporated in that, of course, is the 8th principle. And we don't really, he has ideas I'm sure that we're not aware of, so we kind of need to get ourselves together as a team in Sunny Hill. First UU, I understand, is kind of on the starting process. I know that congregation has done a lot in the past because I attended a whole series of workshops on race at their church that ended. Well, it ended and then they started doing it by video just when the pandemic started. So we did finish that program there. I believe Ginger Hill's also moving towards accepting. I don't think that's finished yet. I'm not sorry. If I'm misstating that, please correct my notes. And that's what I have for my group.
Great, thank you. Anyone else from room 2? Okay, room 1, that's Karen, Kathy and Paul, and Leah.
I guess I took the notes. So talked about a number of things, all related, of course, that one is that to help us understanding that a lot of us who are white, and all of us, don't really appreciate the need and appreciate the struggle and the journey, and that we need to have better education individually as a group so that we understand what the need is and how we can help. To also support the church anti-racism task force committees, to not just at the systemic and at the congregation level, but also to change our individual habits and to broaden our social circles without being patronizing, but to intentionally, bypass the limited social networks that are based in a racist society. And then the thing that we've talked about is that it's okay that we're on different parts. Everyone's not going to be on the same part of that path to understanding and to activation of being more, helping be more anti-racist and being more inclusive. But it's important to, even though you're on different parts of the path is good, but what's not okay is if people, and this is a small percentage of the congregation generally, but we've seen this in several congregations where there are very toxic, very racist members, a lot of times who are very intellectual but don't have a broad social group, and are very eugenicist oriented. And those people can also tend to be major church donors. And so churches sometimes tend to shy away from challenging them if they can't join on the journey, because they don't want to, isolate them either from a long-term church member or isolate their money. And we got to understand that at some point, if people aren't somewhere along the path, that we have to realize that they're no longer good for the congregation, and they're making the church unwelcoming for a broader demographic. Okay. Anyone else from group want to add to that? Okay.
All right, thank you for sharing. I definitely think there's some kinds of next step conversations that have occurred. I like the language from Adrienne Marie Brown of thinking about how we take the next elegant step. So there is, I think somebody had said in the call, there's no solution to this. It's not like you're going to arrive one day and be like, yay, we're suddenly anti-racist. It's like if you ask feminists from the 1970s, have we arrived in, freedom for all women? Well, no, that's an ongoing process with, a trend towards, but we're not there yet. That's the same thing for all of this, right? That it's a long-term journey. It's not a one and done. And so to be thinking about like, what's the next step for your community? What moves it just a little bit further than it is today? And the eighth principle can be a tool that helps your conversation, at least have the conversation in a focused way. I do want to lift up something that I forgot to say in my keynote, because there was a lot to say, which is the wordsmithing piece of this. We often will get stuck on words instead of actions. It's a part of white supremacy culture. It's not just Unitarian Universal. It's the way our society kind of focuses on the love of words and doesn't necessarily move into action. And I think another part of that, we're never going to like fully arrive on this, is if we wait for the perfect language, the exact way that we're going to do this, those sorts of things, we're just never going to do the work, right? And what matters more is that we're actually doing the stuff that we need to do. So what we invite congregations to do is to know that, yeah, the eighth principle is not necessarily a perfect thing. It never will be. It will likely not be exactly what we vote on in 2023. And actually, none of that really matters. What matters is being committed to the spirit of the thing and to accept it as this is what congregations are voting on broadly, so that you're part of a larger community doing this. And then you focus more on, if we're to agree with this statement, generally speaking, what is our next action? So you have folks who will really get stuck on the language piece, and we could get stuck there, but the real invitation is to let it be enough rather than perfect. Live into the enoughness of it and do the next thing. There are tons of workshops. There's another one that I'm not thinking of that they've been running in Ithaca. There are a lot of different programs. I put links in the chat to Jubilee 3 and Beloved Conversations. I also want to note there's Jubilee Kids, which is oriented towards families doing Jubilee, and a number of other programs. I've put resources at the end of this document, and if you have other ideas of programs, please feel free to add them there. So there's lots of resources and other things. So I think, Marilyn, that addresses, oh, you had a question about what percentage. If your congregation already has established policies and rules for things like supporting Black Lives Matter or something like that, that's a good percentage. Otherwise, what I've seen a lot of congregations is say 90%. Because if you have a lot of folks who just aren't there yet, you're gonna have a hard time making it happen. You really do need a significant portion. But I think that's a conversation for your board to kind of work out, is what is the percentage either according to your bylaws, or if that's not already established, what makes sense to make sure that the majority of your congregation is actively supporting the change. Does that make sense? Okay. Are there other questions or thoughts for the good of the order? one thing I will say about doing this work is it always feels wonderfully or not so wonderfully incomplete, right? And that's okay. That's a natural feeling at this stage in the game, because we don't know how to do this. If we knew how to do it, we would have done it already, right? Like this isn't a thing. We're kind of learning how to all be in community together and to do this kind of work. So lean into that, like, I don't know. That's okay. That's a good place to be, particularly at this stage of the pandemic. And know that you have this amazing community of folks who all can support you. You've now met each other and hopefully can connect. And know that the Pittsburgh cluster is talking about doing some more conversation on this in November. So this is not the end even for the Pittsburgh cluster work. Yeah, so with that, New Day Rising was limited to only the people who attended it. So that's actually not more broadly available. Beth, correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Unfortunately, Sunshine, you are. New Day Rising is available at the UU Leadership Institute. That's uuinstitute.org as a class that you can purchase.
Excellent, thank you. See, this is why I trust my colleagues. All right, thank you everyone. And with that, I'm going to pass this on to Karen.
I'd like to close today with a reading from Tammy Dixon. It's titled #Black Lives Matter. Black lives matter, period. White supremacy is a lie we were told centuries ago, a lie whose poison has fracked the foundation upon which we stand. The centuries of pain and suffering that this lie has caused is immeasurable. The pain it is still causing is immoral. As a white woman, I will never know what it means to live in a Black or brown body. My white body doesn't keep me immune from pain, but it does protect me from experiencing the particular types of pain that the lie of white supremacy demands from Black and brown bodies. A pain that means being murdered for walking, shopping, driving, jogging, celebrating, living, being. A pain that means being afraid of people who are charged with protecting. It is time I examine how the lie of white supremacy has manifested into my life, into my home, into my job, into my schooling, into my church, and into my bones. But I can't do this on my own. I need you. Grace Lee Boggs said, "Now is the time on the clock of the world to grow our souls." It is time. It is time. It is time. It is time. It is long past time. Can we walk this journey together? Can we listen together? Can we learn together? Can we love together? Can we heal together? Will we take action together? Stephen Faggy, another member of the Pittsburgh Cluster Board, will extinguish the chalice with some words for us. Stephen?
Hello, this is closing words by the youth on Worship Web, which I thought was appropriate for the occasion. We are never complete. We are never finished. We are always yet to be. May we always allow others to be and help and enable each other to grow toward all we are capable of becoming. Amen.
Thank you, Stephen. And now for the benediction, Reverend Sunshine.
Of course, and want to let folks know we will leave the room open just for social time if you would like some of that with one another. I invite you to simply be present in this moment, to know that for as broken as our world can be, we are still deeply interconnected. We are that great mystery embodied. And for each thing that we do, each way that we act, each little bit that we carry forward, we help bring the world into deeper connection and wholeness. So may your communities and your congregations continue the work of healing and connecting and of being radically and wildly inclusive and open. You are enough, my friends, to take this just a little bit further. May you be blessed in all of your good work, and may you know forever and always, you are not alone. Blessed be.
And thanks so much, Reverend Sunshine, for being a part of this morning. Your words, as always, touched and moved me anyway to lean into the work even more. So thank you.